The Vietnam War didn't begin with a single dramatic declaration, no clear-cut moment of ignition. Instead, it was a slow, insidious descent into chaos, a quagmire of complex politics, escalating violence, and ultimately, unimaginable bloodshed. It was a conflict born of ideologies and fears, played out on a distant stage. For young Americans, many barely out of their teens, Vietnam was a world away, a place they could scarcely imagine. It was a land of suffocating heat where the humidity clung to you like a second skin, and dense jungles teemed with unseen dangers. And it was a war against an invisible enemy, a foe that blended seamlessly into the landscape. This was a war of shadows, ambushes, and hidden tunnels, not clearly defined front lines and traditional battles. The conflict's roots stretched far back, entangled in the history of French colonialism and the unwavering determination of Ho Chi Minh and his followers in their fight for Vietnamese independence. America, driven by the Cold War fear of the spread of communism, intervened, framing its involvement as a noble stand for democracy and the containment of a global threat. But on the ground, the reality was far more tangled and morally ambiguous, rife with political corruption within the South Vietnamese government, simmering religious strife, and a deep, underlying desire for Vietnamese unity that transcended ideological divides. The enemy was everywhere, and yet, frustratingly, nowhere to be found. Seemingly ordinary farmers tending their rice paddies by day, only to transform into Viet Cong fighters under the cover of night. Paranoia began to set in, a creeping unease that eroded trust and heightened tensions. Every villager, every seemingly quiet moment, held the potential for hidden danger, a booby trap, or a sudden attack. The American presence, initially a small contingent of military advisors, gradually grew from a handful of advisors to a massive deployment of over 500,000 troops, a colossal undertaking that strained the nation's resources and its conscience, unleashing an overwhelming display of firepower, from relentless bombing campaigns to the devastating use of napalm. Yet, for every enemy killed, more seemed to rise from the ashes, fueled by a fierce determination and unwavering commitment to their cause. The war machine relentlessly devoured lives and resources, both American and Vietnamese. Vietnam became a quagmire, a seemingly endless cycle of violence and stalemate, a bog of moral and strategic complexities. It was, in many ways, an unwinnable war from the very start, a conflict destined to leave deep scars on both nations. The US military was built for conventional battles, but Vietnam was a different war. The Viet Cong mastered guerrilla tactics, striking from the shadows, then vanishing. Their goal wasn't to win territory, but to outlast and bleed the Americans. Booby traps and hidden tunnels turned every step into a gamble. The jungle itself became the enemy, eroding morale and trust. American firepower was often useless against an enemy who melted into the landscape. Search and destroy missions rarely found their targets but exposed soldiers to ambushes and fear. The infamous body count became the measure of success, but it was a hollow metric. Civilians and combatants were indistinguishable, fueling tragedy and resentment. The war's unconventional nature rendered American advantages nearly meaningless. In Vietnam, the enemy was a ghost, impossible to pin down, impossible to defeat by force alone. Winning hearts and minds was the official goal, but the reality was far different. The South Vietnamese government, propped up by the US, was seen as corrupt and illegitimate. Ho Chi Minh, in contrast, was a nationalist hero to many. American aid and development projects couldn't overcome deep political divides. US military tactics, search and destroy, free fire zones, Agent Orange, alienated the very people they hoped to win over. Every civilian casualty became a recruiting tool for the Viet Cong. The cycle of violence and mistrust only deepened. As one Marine put it, "For every Viet Cong we kill, we create 6 more." The battle for trust was lost before it began. The year was 1968, a year of upheaval both at home and abroad, and in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive changed everything. It was a pivotal moment, a turning of the tide in a conflict that had already claimed so much. In a coordinated surprise attack, North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, and Viet Cong forces struck with a ferocity unseen before. The scale and audacity of the offensive were truly shocking. They targeted over 100 cities and military installations, including the capital, Saigon. The fighting raged in the streets, bringing the war directly into the heart of urban centers. Militarily, the US and South Vietnamese forces, though initially caught off guard, quickly rallied and repelled the assault, pushing back the enemy with considerable firepower. In doing so, they inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, decimating their ranks and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The NVA and Viet Cong paid a heavy price for their daring offensive, but despite the military victory, the sheer shock of the attack shattered American confidence. The public, already weary of the war, began to question the official narrative. Images of chaos and violence flooded television screens, bringing the brutal reality of the war into American living rooms. These stark images directly contradicted years of official optimism from government officials and military leaders, who had consistently painted a rosy picture of progress in the war. Perhaps the most symbolic moment was the sight of Viet Cong soldiers inside the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, a brazen act that shook the nation. This single image destroyed the illusion of progress and invincibility that the U.S. government had so carefully cultivated. Public trust in government collapsed. Anti-war protests intensified, fueled by a growing sense of disillusionment and anger. The credibility gap, the difference between what the government said and what the public perceived, became a canyon impossible to bridge. Even respected news anchor Walter Cronkite, who had previously supported the war effort, declared the conflict a stalemate after witnessing the aftermath of Tet firsthand. His assessment resonated deeply with the American public, echoing the nation's growing doubts and fears about the war's unwinnable nature. The Tet Offensive, therefore, was a military win for the United States and South Vietnam, no doubt about it. But it was also a profound psychological and political disaster, exposing the vulnerabilities of the American strategy and the fragility of public support. It broke the will of American leadership, eroded public support for the war, and ultimately paved the way for the eventual withdrawal of U.S. forces. The war's end, though still years away, was now inevitable, a consequence of the shattered confidence and the loss of faith in the mission. Tet marked the turning point, a watershed moment that forever altered the course of the Vietnam War in American history. It was a paradox of victory and defeat, a bittersweet moment where military success was overshadowed by political and social turmoil. The beginning of the end had arrived, signaling the start of the final, agonizing phase of the Vietnam conflict. Vietnam was the first war broadcast nightly into American living rooms. Graphic images of combat and suffering eroded public support and split the nation. The anti-war movement grew, fueled by outrage over the draft and mounting casualties. Protests erupted on campuses and in cities, dividing young and old, hawks and doves. The war at home became as fierce as the one abroad. Political leaders struggled to maintain support. President Johnson chose not to run again. Nixon promised peace with honor, but expanding the war only deepened the crisis. The home front became a battlefield. America lost unity, and with it, the will to fight. The war was lost not just in Vietnam, but in the hearts and minds of Americans. For nearly 3 million Americans, Vietnam was a personal hell. The average soldier was 19, thrust into a world of constant danger and moral ambiguity. The jungle, the heat, and the invisible enemy wore down body and mind. Soldiers faced impossible choices. Friend and foe were indistinguishable. Tragedies like the My Lai massacre revealed the war's darkest side. Many fought only to survive and protect their comrades, not for ideology. Returning home, veterans found a divided, often hostile nation. There were no parades, only indifference or blame. Many struggled with PTSD, haunted by memories and guilt. The government was slow to help, leaving veterans isolated. The war's true cost was measured in broken lives and lasting trauma. For many, the battle never really ended. By 1975, the long and arduous conflict in Vietnam was drawing to a close. The situation had become increasingly untenable for the South Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese forces were poised to seize a decisive victory. Years of fighting, political maneuvering, and international involvement had culminated in this final, critical moment. The Paris Peace Accords, signed with the hope of bringing an end to the bloodshed, ultimately failed to secure lasting peace. The fragile agreements quickly unraveled, leaving a power vacuum and setting the stage for renewed conflict. With the accords in tatters, the North Vietnamese People's Army, bolstered by unwavering resolve and significant military support, prepared for a final, all-out assault on the South. Their objective was clear: to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. The South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, faced an increasingly dire situation, plagued by widespread corruption, inadequate resources, and critically low morale. They were ill-prepared to withstand the coming onslaught. As the North Vietnamese forces advanced, the ARVN's defenses crumbled, and their lines collapsed quickly, leading to a swift and devastating rout. The impending fall of Saigon triggered chaotic scenes of panic and desperation. The U.S. Embassy became the focal point of a frantic evacuation effort, with helicopters evacuating American personnel and as many desperate South Vietnamese allies as possible from the embassy roof. Tragically, many South Vietnamese who had placed their trust in America and worked alongside them were left behind, abandoned to face the potential for persecution and retribution under the new regime. On April 30, 1975, the inevitable occurred. North Vietnamese tanks triumphantly rolled into Saigon, marking the definitive end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam under communist control. For the United States, the outcome was a deeply humiliating defeat, a stark reminder of the limitations of its power and influence. The war had claimed the lives of over 58,000 Americans, and the stated goal of preserving a free and independent South Vietnam had been irrevocably lost. The fall of Saigon delivered a crushing blow to America's sense of invincibility, leaving a lasting scar on the nation's psyche. For Vietnam, the arrival of peace did not bring immediate prosperity or healing, but rather a continuation of devastation. The country was left with a ruined landscape, millions of its citizens dead or wounded, and the imposition of a harsh new communist regime. The promised utopia of socialist prosperity and equality never materialized. Instead, the years following the war were marked by widespread poverty, political repression, and social upheaval. Although the fighting had ceased, the suffering endured, casting a long shadow over generations of Vietnamese families. In the end, the war's conclusion was a bitter and painful experience for both the United States and Vietnam, a stark reminder of the human cost of ideological conflict. The Vietnam War's echoes still shape both America and Vietnam. For the U.S., defeat led to soul-searching and skepticism about foreign intervention. The Vietnam Syndrome haunted American policy for decades. The war left deep social scars dividing those who served from those who protested. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial became a place of mourning and healing. For Vietnam, unification came at a terrible cost: ruined land, poisoned soil, and a traumatized people. Economic hardship and repression followed, driving many to flee. Today, the two nations are partners, but the past lingers. The war is a reminder military might cannot always overcome nationalism. Its consequences will echo for generations to come.